Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Beverly Hills Bar Association program, Police Reform Part 2, Recruitment, Training, Court Process, and Challenges of Police Work. I'm Levon Lawson, and I'm going to introduce our speakers. Before the program, just a few comments about the Beverly Hills Bar Association. One, a couple comments on membership. As you will note on your screen and in the materials, the Beverly Hills Bar Association has varying levels of membership. The bar has added a number of new offerings, providing a lot of value at each level. And as well, they've added new levels. So we have a professional level, a sustainer level, and an economy level. There's research, there are referral networks, there are opportunities for workspaces, online community, and of course, unlimited online CLE at professional level. There is online CLE at the sustainer economy levels as well. So there's a lot to do at the Bar Association. There's something for everyone. If you're a member, thank you. If you're not yet a member, we hope that you'll consider it. On to virtual offices. The Beverly Hills Bar Association has a virtual office program. Comes in quite handy if you happen to work from home or some other locale. The program offers access to professional business services that include daily mail scan as well as conference space. So if you're interested in virtual offices, and particularly the Beverly Hills Bar Association Virtual Office Program, you can learn more at the website, or please feel free to contact the Beverly Hills Bar Association. Finally, the network. This program is brought to you by the network, which is an attorney networking and referral program at the Bar Association, with the understanding that as members get to know each other better and know what they do, there's better opportunities to do business, to give and receive referrals, and just to provide value all around. So if you are a member, we hope that you'll take a look at the network and join us. The network meets monthly. Now to introduce our speakers, we have Ninette Toosbuy. Ninette is a former LAPD detective and Board of Rights representative. She was with the LAPD for 24 years, 17 of those years as a detective, and where she also ran a sex crimes unit. While at the LAPD, Ms. Toosbuy was a lead instructor of police interview and interrogations. She reformed curriculum to science-based, non-confrontational interviews and interrogation practices. Currently, Ms. Toosbuy investigates workplace conflicts and provides presentations and consultation on investigative interviewing and interpersonal communications. We have DeWitt and Lacy, civil rights attorney with the renowned law office of John Burris. Mr. Lacy has significant experience in the areas of Section 1983 civil rights litigation, employment discrimination, and personal injury. He has successfully litigated wrongful death actions and civil rights violations throughout California. Mr. Lacy brings a great deal of experience and perspective to this discussion. Dr. Barbara C. Pavlo, police psychologist. Dr. Barbara Pavlo has been a licensed clinical psychologist since 2001. She's been with the LAPD since 2006. At the LAPD, her duties have ranged from clinically treating sworn and civilian personnel to consulting with the SWAT team on barricade and hostage negotiations. She has, one of her subject areas is police morale. The 2019 book, The Blue Morale Project, was co-authored by Dr. Pavlo, and it has become quite a reference work on the topic. Last but not least, we have our moderator panelist, Dimitri Gorin. He's a former deputy DA and a criminal law specialist with the firm of Eisner Gorin. Mr. Gorin specializes in the defense of complex criminal cases. He's a former senior deputy DA for Los Angeles County. He's litigated a number of officer-involved shootings, both with the district attorney's office as well as a defense attorney with his firm. Mr. Gorin regularly lectures on how to handle criminal defense issues in civil litigation, family law, and private investigations. With that, I will turn that over to our speakers.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. We are doing a second portion of our program dealing with police reform, and I want to launch into it. I think the public, there's public perception that police use too much force. They shoot people at random. They attack folks for no reason. On the other hand, all of us would agree we do want the police. So The idea to defund the police, meaning to get rid of police departments, probably doesn't make much sense to most people, because we do need law enforcement to keep our streets safe. And God forbid we have a burglary or a break into our car or our home, we call the police for help. So the real issue is not to defund the police, but how to improve the police, how to reform law enforcement so that we as a society feel the police not only protect us, but also don't abuse us. And so with that kind of theme, overarching theme, how to improve policing, that's going to be our theme for this presentation. With that in mind, we have a detective, a civil rights attorney, as well as a psychologist, and they're going to be our experts in dealing with this very complex issue. I am a certified criminal law specialist, and I can talk about more of how the court process deals with law enforcement officers that are under investigation and are accused of improper civil and criminal wrongdoings. So my first question is this issue of reform. What can be done when you're dealing with police officers that have constantly and have had prior problems, have had prior complaints against them, and are now in trouble again, such as in the Floyd case where the main officer allegedly had prior issues? Ninette, what do you think, or Detective Toosbuy, what do you think about that?
Well, I can speak for LAPD. LAPD implemented quite some years ago a tracking system, keeping track of officers or detectives who had repeated allegations that were similar in nature. So, for example, excessive use of force. And so those were things that the department would look at and then try to address proactively. I'm not sure that all police departments do that, but that was certainly a mechanism. That is a mechanism that LAPD has in place today to identify such officers.
And DeWitt, in your civil litigation practice, do you see in the lawsuits you file officers usually with a spotty record that are being sued?
Generally, that's the case. Most officers probably go through their entire career without having to discharge their firearm or use deadly force. Those that do seemingly have the chance of repeating that use of force more often. Maybe it makes it easier for them psychologically. I don't know. But it does seem like folks who have used force before, especially deadly force, are likely to use it again. And I want to piggyback a little bit on what Detective Toosbuy was saying as far as a database which gives some context to people's individual use of force and whether or not it's being tracked. Most cities and municipalities do not do that. Some do track use of force, but even more importantly, if there's no joint database, if a law enforcement officer, for example, does something bad and kills somebody as a member of the LAPD when they shouldn't have, and they're fired or terminated or choose to go somewhere else, odds are the other department doesn't have any access to that and will not be aware.
I see. Dr. Pavlo, how do you explain that from a psychological perspective? Why do the same officers tend to have problems? In other words, in Mr. Lacy's experience, it seems like most officers have never discharged a gun during their career. Yet, when you look at somebody like Floyd, who did not discharge a gun but had allegedly prior use of force issues, he was still on the department at the time of his being on top of Mr. Floyd. So why does that happen within the police society, within law enforcement?
You know, there's all different types of people that join the police department for different reasons. And some people are intrinsically more aggressive than others. And I think the aggressive police officers continue to be aggressive, and it's their way of fighting crime. Whereas other people use more of a verbal way of trying to connect, and some people are much more physical. So I'm not surprised that DeWitt has said that it seems like people have a history of being aggressive. It makes sense.
And so, Detective Toosbuy, was that your experience when you were on the force with respect to some officers being more verbal and others being more physically aggressive?
Absolutely. Obviously, I believe that, DeWitt brought this up, that there is no monolithic, to make a blanket statement. I mean, you can make generalizations, but overall, each individual officer brings his or her personality and skill set and ability to the job, and it's going to be varied. So there are some officers that tend to be more inclined to escalate things into physical force versus there are others that are much better at verbalization.
Isn't that, Detective Toosbuy, something that can be addressed through training and also addressed through, say, diversity of hiring different types of officers, people of color, as well as more women officers?
Well, I think that emphasizing communications training, I'm not sure exactly what the curriculum is today. I can talk about what it was like when I went through and what I hear from officers, but I think there should be more efforts put into communications training. Additionally, we also have to look at how are we recruiting? Who are we, with our recruitment efforts, what personality type are we drawing to the job? And I feel that there's a disconnect between how we present the job in order to recruit and entice people versus what the job is in reality. And that, I think, is something that needs to be addressed.
DeWitt, what do you think?
I would have to agree with that wholeheartedly. Look, it's been said to me that the law enforcement community boasts a very tough guy mentality. And that doesn't necessarily make for the best circumstances when police go out into communities and are needed to de-escalate the situations and investigate, rather than to come in as a hammer and forcefully gain whatever type of investigative information they need. Sometimes it can be as easily as lowering your voice, speaking calmer, maybe not taking some type of aggressive and or physical action like grabbing somebody. That might get the officer to the answers they want. But what's being broadcast to trainees is, look, you get to kick down doors, you get to carry guns, car chases, all the things that are the exciting, quote unquote, parts of policing that we see in the movies. These are the things that are being used as recruitment materials. And in some regards, the effect is you're getting a batch of folks who may not necessarily be cut out to do the work that police officers need to do.
Dr. Pavlo, what do you think? How do we deal with this issue of officers that are overly aggressive and say choose not to use their communication skills? What can the departments do to improve that?
Well, I'm going to answer that question in a moment. I just wanted to say LAPD, I can only speak for them since I work for them, is really very progressive. We're really talking about emotional intelligence with the officers. We're telling them how to de-escalate. And while, yes, it's very appealing to break down doors and, catch the bad guys and all of that, really doesn't happen that often. And we are mandating right now that officers know how to deal with the mentally ill. Each mental illness, autism versus psychotic bipolar, you're going to have a very different interaction. So, we are aware of that. And as you said, to answer your question, how do we deal with these aggressive officers? As Ninette pointed out, we do keep track of them, and they are under constant scrutiny. And the other thing that we do at LAPD, and I don't know if other police agencies do this, if there is any kind of officer-involved shooting, fatal, non-fatal, accidental discharge, they have to see a psychologist at least 3 times, and we have to clear them, because oftentimes police officers are ex-military and they may have some post-traumatic stress that they're unaware of, but it manifests itself. So we're there to help them uncover that and work through it. So we're really on top of it so that these situations don't happen.
In terms of hiring, I have read articles and studies that show that people that come from communities of color, as well as women, tend to be more understanding of folks that are in distress, perhaps. They tend, again, this is just studies, that generally they can try to de-escalate situations better. So is there anything in training, in recruitment that, say with LAPD, that focuses on getting a more diverse officer base?
Yes, absolutely. We're trying to meet the needs of the community. So Ninette and I actually were talking about this. Statistically speaking, Ninette, is it like 52% Hispanic? You kind of know those numbers?
Yeah, the numbers for LAPD in terms of the demographic breakdown is a little over 50% are Hispanic, Latino, approximately 30% are white, Caucasian, and approximately 9% are African American. So those figures pretty much are reflective of the population in the city of Los Angeles. And then the remaining is Pacific, Asian, South Asian, and so forth. So the only figure that is not reflective upon the general population is gender. So only approximately 18% of the police force for LAPD are women. But that said, I also think it is simply not realistic to think that you would have a police department that's 50% or 51% female, because the truth is, and maybe some people don't want to say it, but I just don't think that women are inherently attracted to this line of work in the same way that men might be. And so that number is always going to be lower than the representation in terms of the public, the general public.
Got it. Now, in terms of just quick and dirty, is there anything we can do to the is there anything that law enforcement can do now to make the public feel safer, to make the public feel like, hey, they're not going to come into my community and harass us and hurt us, that we should feel safe? Is there anything, say, LAPD or other departments can do to quick and dirty make people feel better? DeWitt, what do you think?
More foot patrols. That has been an answer that many police departments have began to institute. And what it does is it creates more of a personal relationship with that officer on the beat. If you get to know the people who own the corner store or the cross guards near the school, you forge a personal relationship rather than the folks in the community just seeing a patrol car, which doesn't have any real personal connection besides an emergency and or sometimes a dangerous situation. But foot patrols are definitely something that allows a greater connection between the community and local law enforcement. I would also argue that having some type of civilian oversight that actually has teeth will actually give community members the confidence that their cries and woes will be heard by local law enforcement.
Dr. Pavlo, what's LAPD doing to address, again, quick and dirty, because these things take time to implement and for them to work, but what can LAPD do, or what is LAPD doing to make the community feel safer?
Well, LAPD is very active in all different communities, speaking to people, wanting to know what they need and what it is they want, and we're delivering. We're not just asking questions, but changing things. But my personal belief is that we need to educate the public. I don't think the public knows what to do, what to expect from a traffic stop. For example, as Ninette talked about, the death walk. As a police officer walks up to a car, they don't know who's in it. And if there are tinted windows, they don't know if someone's in the back with a shotgun aimed at them. There are many trainings that show police officers walking up during a traffic stop and getting injured, getting killed. So the first thing is roll down your windows, put your hands on the steering wheel. Something as simple as that can avoid a really bad situation. Compliance, even if you disagree. I mean, I've been stopped, many times, unfortunately. And, I disagreed. Why are you stopping me? But I didn't approach the officer. I just said, why did you stop me? Polite. And because don't forget, the officer's a human being as well. They're scared. They don't know what they're walking into. And they've heard horror stories. They've seen horror stories. So I think the public needs to be educated on what's proper procedure so that we can eliminate a lot of this running away, both parties being scared and it resulting in a death.
Ninette, what was your experience as a police officer in terms of the death walk people talk about when you're approaching a vehicle you pulled over, as well as I know there's a lot of writings about the police officers needing to keep an edge and being highly vigilant about the possible risk to their safety, because you never know who's around the corner. You never know who wants to take a shot at you or throw something at you. What was your experience?
It's quite true. I mean, the thing is, most contacts are not going to be that. But irrespective of how small that percentage is, as a human being, you're thinking, okay, maybe out of 100 stops, that might be the guy who's the cop killer, but I want to go home alive tonight. I want to go home to my family. So you have to have that edge, being prepared, knowing that what could seem like a very routine engagement with a person could turn deadly very quickly. And so I think in terms of going back to a question that you just asked previously, so how can we bridge that gap? One of the things that I think would be fantastic is for the public to have greater access to some of the aspects of our training, such as the FAT simulator, where officers are presented with the shoot, don't shoot scenario. And every non-law enforcement person that I know who has gone through that, I mean, it was mind-blowing to them, because invariably they got themselves in that scenario where they shot somebody who shouldn't have been shot or didn't shoot and ended up getting killed. And although it's not the same as the real life thing, but it gives some perspective. So as much as officers need to meet the public halfway and understand the history like DeWitt mentioned and so forth, likewise, I also think that the public needs to understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of somebody who's non-compliant. The moment somebody's non-compliant, it freaks a cop out, because you're thinking, why not? An average, normal, law-abiding citizen would just do what I'm asking them to do. So that's the tricky part, right? Seeing it from both sides.
DeWitt, what do you think?
Look, there's no doubt that law enforcement has a tough job, right? One of the things I often tell juries is that it's not reasonable necessarily for them to say what would they do in that situation, because they're not trained officers. Law enforcement officers go through quite a deal of training, and there's been a lot of criticism on whether or not the police academies do enough in order to prepare law enforcement officers to go out into the public in situations where they might confront or contact confrontational people. But they do have a lot of training, so their response is going to be different. They are trained a lot more than your average person. So look, yeah, they have a tough job, but if they use the skills and tools that are given to them, and if those skills and tools are promoted well enough within the department itself, I think you'd see a different result. I think part of the problem is the skills of de-escalation and communication are not promoted in the departments. And much more of what is promoted are defensive tactics, hands-on, and shooting. And so that's what people revert to.
Dr. Pavlo, is that your experience? The training for the officer, I see there's two different issues. There's the training for the officer to be safe and to defend himself and defend the public and defend his partner officer. That's on one side. On the other side, DeWitt is talking about de-escalation and using words rather than using your hands and using violence. So what's your view on that?
My view is, unfortunately, DeWitt, I'm sorry, I differ with it. Again, LAPD, being part of the SWAT team, the crisis negotiation team, a SWAT call averages anywhere from 4 hours to 24 hours. And that's because we are not going in quickly. We are talking and we are de-escalating the situation. De-escalation is being taught right now in our academies. People are practicing. I just saw a recruitment class, and there was somebody who, they just put a scene together, and they were teaching the officers how to say, calm down. It was a mentally ill person that they were using this on, and they were teaching them how to speak to them, how to reach out, how to calm them down. We really have gone away from hands-on, and I think to a certain extent, handcuffing a person, it would be better, because if you handcuff somebody, then you don't run the risk of them running away. You're just detaining them. You're not necessarily arresting them like in a domestic violence dispute. And they're not using it so much now in the LAPD because they are wanting to verbalize it. But I think there's a time not to, be aggressive and hit somebody or do something other than detain a person if they're in domestic violence, get the situation, then uncuff them. So there's no risk of flight, no risk of feeling like your life is in danger. Ninette said something, and they're taught someone's going to go home tonight, and I want it to be me. They have families, they have a life. So, they're in a situation where they get scared too. They're not supposed to show that they're afraid. That's part of that command presence. But they are taught to de-escalate. They are taught to not go forward with any kind of lethal means or less lethal, but to talk first. And that's a last resort.
Ninette, in terms of how frequently because we see these videos and they're horrible. You have officers shooting suspects in the back. You have officers putting their knees on a suspect who's got trouble breathing. You have just excessive use of force, officers slapping, striking suspects. And that's all the public sees because that's what's, the media is showing. Those incidents should get media attention because it shows misconduct. But at the same time, how does that really represent the total number of contacts police officers have? What is your experience? How frequently does use of force happen or shootings happen in terms of your experience as a police officer?
Well, so you hit a very valid point, and that is that these horrific incidents that we see on the media are highlighted and sensationalized, and so you get the outrage because they are awful. But the fact of the matter is that, and I can just talk about the numbers for LAPD, but then imagine all the other police departments that are out there in our country, is that LAPD responds to millions of radio calls annually. Of those radio calls that they respond to, less than 0.01%, even I think a smaller number than that, result in uses of force and in killings, right? So if you look at the statistically, it is a tiny, tiny, tiny number. Now, that doesn't mean that it's okay. Please don't misunderstand me. But what I'm saying is that the way it gets portrayed in the media is that it's blown over proportion, not to take away from the life, but in terms of how frequently that happens. And like I mentioned earlier, if you were to look at how many people die in surgery due to medical negligence, people would be equally outraged, right? Because it's a human life. But yet that happens, but it doesn't get profiled the same way because it's not out in the public eye. It's in an operating room. But there are parallels to that.
I'm going to go to Dr. Pavlo. Are you guys doing anything with LAPD to educate the public in terms of the reform LAPD is undertaking? So the only thing the public is seeing isn't just the horrible videos on TV. Is there something the public can, maybe a website or videos the public can review to actually see what reforms LAPD is instituting?
Yes, I think Chief Michael Moore has been excellent in bringing transparency to the department. For a long time, we didn't have body worn, but body worn is released and people can actually see what's going on. And the department is huge on transparency right now and really making each and every individual officer responsible for their behaviors. For example, during these riots, the chief has come up with that if anybody, regardless if they were protesting, rioting, looting, wants your ID, and your information or your serial number, you shall, which means you must give it to them. So I think that's a huge effort in reaching out to the community and saying that we're working together. I mean, we're all human beings. And I think the police, in psychology, there's a identified patient, normally in a family setting. And I think the police now are bearing that burden of being that identified patient. But it's an effort. We're all human and it's a system. I mean, there's political agendas involved in this. There's the police officers, there's the community, and everyone needs to get together on the same page.
DeWitt, what do you think about that? In your experience, I know you do civil rights, so you only will take cases that are the ones that are usually the worst of the worst to sue the department. But what is your experience in terms of cases in courts dealing with law enforcement, and how frequently do actual use of force incidents happen?
So, look, I don't have the numbers for all of California because all that information isn't even recorded. And nor do I have all the numbers for LAPD. But what I can say is this, just from common knowledge, though all the contacts related to excessive uses of force and or wrongful death actions may be low as far as percentage-wise, there is definitely a disproportionality in those unlawful contacts coming in communities of color, especially Black and brown communities or poorer communities. There's no doubt in my mind that the way law enforcement officers respond in their regular and usual course of business to folks who live in Beverlywood versus those who might live in South Central are different. And sure, you got to use different communication tactics and styles for different circumstances and situations. But the dignity and respect that may be given to folks in a more affluent neighborhood is often not what is given to those in poor neighborhoods. And that's, I think, what leads to more incidents of use of force and excessive force in our Black and brown communities. And that's something that cannot be denied. It cannot be denied or ignored. And it's something we got to do something about. There's an honest conversation we have to have about race that we just haven't had in this country yet.
Ninette, did you see that as an LAPD officer? I assume you were assigned to different divisions. Did you see that contrast between the way the public, say, is treated in more affluent neighborhoods as opposed to the inner city neighborhoods?
I would have to agree with DeWitt that that is a reality, and we can't escape that reality. And I saw that firsthand, that depending on what community you were patrolling and what division you were working, things were done a little differently. Now,
and I'm wondering if this also is part of the psychology of police. Sometimes when you could say you're in an inner city high risk community where there are more gangs, more shootings, because we'd all agree if you go to Beverlywood, you're not going to have gang membership as much at all, probably. Whereas if you go to Compton or even parts of Lancaster or Pomona, you have more gangs, or San Fernando, you have different gangs. And so there's more guns, there's more risk to law enforcement officers. And so knowing that certain communities are higher risk in terms of crime and higher risk to the police officers, could that explain why the officers have a different attitude than that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the bottom line is all of this, what we're talking about, none of this operates in a vacuum, right? None of this is in a vacuum. It's like different chemicals that are going to react when you throw them together. So of course that has an impact as to how officers then feel that they're going to approach their day when they get, suited up and ready to start their shift. And also just time of day, that even makes a difference, so there's almost a certain subculture within the morning watch, meaning the graveyard shift, versus somebody who works during the day, because the nature of the calls are different. Most of the calls during the day are business disputes. Neighbor doesn't like the fact that, the neighbor cut down a tree or put up an umbrella that he doesn't like the color, things like that. Whereas at night, when people are calling, then generally it tends to be more violence related sort of incidents, right? So just the nature of the work, even within the same division, but depending on your shift, can have a huge variance as to what your day-to-day work life is like as a patrol officer.
So Dr. Pavlo, this dovetails into your specialty, which is being a psychologist. One of the things I have seen in the news, as well as a prosecutor, I was a DA when the Rampart scandal took place, and there was basically a gang culture within certain officers where they basically acted as a gang. They were in a high-risk community and they pulled together as a gang, and they extorted gang members and stole drugs and stole money. They basically had their own clique, and they were a criminal subculture within LAPD. Now, and I understand there was a consent decree, there was oversight of LAPD, things improved, and that's terrific. Now we hear about the sheriff's department, and that there's a certain set of officers that are gang-like type of officers. They have tattoos. Why does this happen? Can you explain from a psychological perspective why officers kind of cross over into this gang mentality themselves and then seem to engage in perhaps criminal acts as part of being part of their own gang within the police department? And the scary thing to the public is, hey, they have a gun, they have the authority, they have handcuffs, they have the training. So why does that happen? What's wrong with, or what causes the officers to turn into this gang subculture in some departments?
I think that's an excellent question. And luckily, at least from my experiences, it's a very small portion. Rampart happened and nothing has happened like that since. We've learned our lessons. Unfortunately, in the sheriff's department, what you're talking about is correct. And I really think the ideology behind that is power. Power, when people feel power and they are able to make people comply and do things that they want, if it goes into with a person with an already personality disorder, narcissism, it feeds it and they become omnipotent and no one can stop them. And the fact that they do have the gun, they do have the badge, you get other people on board, and it feels great doing this. There's money to be involved. There's a lot of secondary gains to it. But first, it's the personality. And there is personality disorder to begin with, which leads to recruitment. And how are we hiring these people? How can a person with a personality disorder pass the psychology test? What are we doing? I think that has to be examined to, at least lessen the probability of this ever happening again.
Got it. But taking the other side of it, DeWitt, in the Floyd case, where you had 4 officers, they were not in a gang, 2 of them were, brand new recruits. How is it that incident happens where you have a man asking for help or can't breathe? Granted, he had some drugs in his system, and granted, he had committed perhaps a felony, but nevertheless, the officer kept his knee on his neck for 7 or 8 minutes. Mr. Floyd passed away. How does that happen within the department that those other 3 officers kind of just stand by? They were just there. They came out to a call. It was nothing anybody expected that they'd be, these 4 officers would later be charged. They certainly didn't plan their day that way. How do you explain that from your perspective, that something like that takes place in America?
Well, I have to give credit to folks who came before me, like John Burris, Johnny Cochran, Carl Douglas, folks who have been doing this type of work for a long time. And I'll say this, there is a thin blue line. And many officers in law enforcement departments look at it as it's us against them. And anybody who is not in blue, so to speak, is part of them. And that culture needs to be dismantled in some regard. Of course, you got to be able to depend on your fellow officer in order to do your job. That shouldn't mean that law enforcement officers can reasonably rely on other officers to have their back, even when they know they're doing wrong. These type of subcultures with gangs have existed not only in the LAPD and the Rampart, but also in the Sheriff's Department back when they had the Vikings, and even in Oakland, California, with the rioters that our office prosecuted many years ago, which brought Oakland in federal receivership. So it's not something new. However, what needs to happen, though, is the culture needs to change, and that has to be top down, because the top brass is kind of what sets the tone. And if it's okay with the top brass, if they're making the kind of jokes about certain groups of people, Black folks, brown folks, or poor folks, if they're making jokes about women as not being equal, then that type of thing goes down to the rank and file folks who are out on the beat. And then it gets distributed equally to folks in the communities.
Ninette, question to you. How does Floyd happen from your perspective as a former police officer? You don't have cops. You have 2 of the officers that were training officers. Chauvin apparently had some prior problems, but how does an incident like that happen? Explain it to us from a law enforcement perspective, that type of use of force incident where somebody dies and the conduct seems pretty egregious.
Well, there's a twofold issue. If you look at the officers that were there who witnessed it, they were junior. One, I think, was his first day, and the other one was also a rookie. So part of some of the liabilities with a paramilitary structure is that as a junior, as a brand new green officer, you do not get to challenge somebody who is your superior. In this instance, they felt that they were very subordinate to Chauvin. And so there's no way they're going to challenge him, not in that paramilitary structure. So that's how 2 or 3 other officers can witness something and not step up and try to change the course. So unless they were equal, or they had more time on the job, or had seniority over Chauvin, then they probably or may have stepped forth and tried to do something. In terms of Floyd saying, I can't breathe, I want my mom, I can't breathe, the sad reality is that, and I can't speak for what was in Chauvin's mind, but I can only speak from what I have seen other officers express, or I've been in given situations where you're thinking, well, I don't believe you. You're just doing that because you want to get out of the position I've got you in, right? You're trying to find a way to escape or to non-comply. And so, officers become very cynical because people lie to us all the time and try to pull a fast one on us. So in this given situation, it's truly tragic because Floyd, in fact, could not breathe. But I think the officers thought, yeah, right, sure. And I know that sounds awful, but I feel based on my experience, that is probably what happened.
How does LAPD or other departments, Dr. Pavlo, deal or train officers to avoid incidents like that, where you have, an excessive use of force, a person passes away? What can be done in terms of training?
Well, they're very, very big on de-escalation and teaching mental awareness, emotional intelligence, reading nonverbal signs, talking to people. We had an incident a couple of years ago where there were a lot of cars that responded, a lot of patrol cars responded to an incident. And Chief Moore said, when there's an incident that takes place, I don't want all these cars there. And they look at the number of shots. They examine everything. There is the consent decree. There is FID, which is Field Investigation Division. There are a lot of different hoops that officers have to go through. Again, I don't think other departments are as ahead of the time as we are, but we learned a great deal from Rampart, and we're really trying to meet the community at a level that makes sense and educate the community and be available to the community, and officers are held responsible. I don't think an incident like that would take place at LAPD. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I don't believe that that would happen.
Okay. So, DeWitt, in terms of the court process, that's one kind of backstop that's independent. You have jurors that make a decision on whether or not an officer's conduct is lawful. So you have 12 members of the community come in and they listen to the evidence and decide. Recently, there was a new law passed, AB 392, that basically judges an officer's use of force in a shooting incident. It goes from what's reasonable to what's necessary to prevent imminent serious injury or death. And there's a police officer right now being prosecuted in San Diego who shot a fleeing suspect who got out of handcuffs, and he's being prosecuted on a theory that the shooting wasn't necessary, that there was no imminent serious injury to anyone, there was no imminent harm of death to anyone, and therefore the officer, who I think shot the suspect 4 times, is being prosecuted for murder. What's your view on that, and what is your experience on how the court process deals with prosecuting law enforcement officers?
Well, I'll say, look, there is legislative intent behind changing the word from what a reasonably prudent officer would do and or should do, and whether or not the conduct is actually necessary, right? And that's going to have to be interpreted by the courts. I would imagine there's going to be a lot of case law around this that's going to develop here in the next year or two. So it remains to be seen how the courts are going to interpret the language that's been changed. To me, I think what that means is exactly as you put it, that the conduct has to be necessary. Was it necessary in order to save the life of either the officers or the public in general? And in the circumstance of the fella down in San Diego, I don't think it was. Even here in the circumstance where an officer shot the individual who was on the bike and allegedly had tossed the gun. The question is, was it necessary? And arguably, it definitely wasn't. Officers, of course, could say, well, we hadn't done a search of this person yet. We didn't know if they had any other weapons. But I think whether or not necessary changes any from what has previously been prosecuted is really going to be up to juries in the court to determine.
Got it. Ninette, in terms of your experience in the courts, what pressure, if any, or what limitation, if any, do the courts play on what officers do on the streets, and how does that impact your policing, knowing that you may have to answer in the courts for your conduct?
When you say conduct, do you mean just in terms of use of force or just in general?
I think in general, I think we have 2 kind of sets of scenarios. A, use of force, which is stopping somebody, perhaps hitting them or using a baton or using the taser, as well as also later you have to testify if that person committed a crime, they had drugs on them or a gun on them, or they're a gang member committing a crime. So both the use of force as well as proving the case, how does that go into your calculus as a police officer when you're out in the streets?
Well, I actually think that when officers, or certainly I can speak for myself as a patrol officer, when you're responding to a radio call, things happen very quickly. Oftentimes, you have no way of really predicting what's going to happen. And so in those moments, you're not thinking about the courts at all. You're not thinking about it at all until after the fact, if in fact you have to go testify. Now you're trying to figure out how you may have to answer things that you believe you might be asked about. And that's where the challenges come in. I do think that when we talk about training, I think that there should be a greater emphasis on preparing officers for court testimony and for being able to articulate why they did what they did. And have a better understanding of reasonable suspicion and probable cause and the reasonable use of whatever force they use. And I feel that that is an area that probably a lot of officers feel a little insecure in terms of being able to articulate it properly.
Got it. I know as a former prosecutor, I used to work with police officers on, strategy on investigating cases, on advising them on how to obtain search warrants, on also advising them on what evidence needs to be obtained before I can file formal charges against a suspect. For me as a former DA, when I have an officer who's compromised because they have, say, credibility issues, because they've lied in a police report, or documented somebody to be a gang member when they're not a gang member, that to me as a former DA, it compromised my own cases. So not to, I'm going to turn to Dr. Pavlo and ask this question. To what extent is LAPD doing anything to prevent, I know there's 3 or 4 officers right now under indictment for basically misstating somebody's gang membership and lying on the police paperwork. And now the DA's office has to go back through the prior cases those officers handled. And they might have been legitimate cases against suspects who have, with guns or drugs or gang activity. So what can LAPD do, or what are they doing to prevent officers from compromising their credibility so that when there is an actual strong criminal case against a suspect, that doesn't get thrown out because of, prior errors of the police officer?
Well, as you just mentioned, there are very severe consequences to not representing the truth correctly. And there is a huge investigation, both internally and externally. So we want our offices to be transparent. We want our offices to tell the truth. And when there's any evidence that they're not telling the truth, or they've bent the truth, or innocently wrote a report in a hurry and it left out an important detail, they do get dinged. They get days off, they get loss of pay, and if it's that serious, there's a board of rights where they can be fired. So I believe, we're on the same side as you. We do want the officers to be real, honest. Integrity is part of our core value, and we practice it and emphasize it.
DeWitt, there's been some legislation pending in California, and I don't know if it's passed, about opening up officers' record for misconduct. Right now, as a criminal defense attorney, if I have a client who tells me, hey, this officer said I could send it to the search of my car, there were drugs in the car, but I never consented, he's lying. If I want to see if that officer has had prior complaints, I have to file something called the pitches motion and jump through a lot of hoops in court, take several months to litigate this issue before the court can let me know whether or not the officers had prior problems. How do you deal with that situation in the civil system? And is there any new legislation you're aware of that's going to make it easier for criminal defense attorneys as well as civil lawyers to obtain prior misconduct evidence against officers?
Well, starting last year, Shirley Weber actually introduced some legislation which in California would allow for the discovery of some of these materials without actually having to file a pitches motion. It should come as easily as filing a public records request. And some of these records should be made available. The question is, how useful are they going to be? In my experience, more oftentimes than not, the officer's prior records of either bad behavior or questionable behavior don't get put before the jury. However, some of my clients, if they had any wrongdoing in their past, that certainly is plastered through the media and or in front of a jury. And I think that is not fair. I think somebody should be able to investigate the officer's prior conduct. Again, along with what we said a little bit earlier, oftentimes, if somebody has exhibited some type of poor or bad behavior, they have done it before and or will do it again. That's not to disparage a lot of the stand-up officers who are out there working hard and making a living the honest way, but there certainly are some who continuously skirt the line or, as has been comically put, are habitual line steppers.
All right. Ninette, what was your experience with the court process? Did you think it treated officers fairly? Did you think it went above and beyond into prying into your background as a police officer?
And you mean just in general going into a criminal trial where there might be some questions about the officer, not in terms of an officer being prosecuted?
Right.
I felt that it was fair. But again, I also feel that a lot of young officers, when they first start having to testify or make some of their first significant arrests, that they're not fully prepared for the court system. I don't think enough time is spent really educating officers what to expect and why there are certain requirements within the court system. And as a result, I believe there's animosity at times between officers and the DA's office because there's a disconnect. And I don't know what your experience was, but I would hear officers complain about the district attorney's office and about why they were or were not filing or why they felt they were being put on the stand as if they were the accused and so forth. And so I think that a lot of these misconceptions should be addressed and having maybe officers meet with district attorneys in an informal setting to have them understand better why certain things are required in the criminal justice system in terms of trial.
Yeah, I mean, I worked with officers closely for 12 years as a district attorney, and you have good relationships. I think the bigger the case, the closer your relationship is with the detective. So if it's a homicide case and you're leading an investigation, you're working with those detectives closely, and you tend to have the best trained officers the more serious the case is. On the other hand, when I was a brand new prosecutor and I worked on the third floor of the criminal courts building, 210 West Temple, I mean, that place is really a zoo. You have 10 or 12 courtrooms. You have dozens and dozens of police officers walking around, milling around from all over LA County. And that's the first time you're meeting up police officers. Sometimes officers have not slept the whole night and they got to testify in the morning. And so I think there may be conflict a little bit when those officers don't understand why the district attorney needs for them to wait in court the whole day, why they're not being prepared to testify, why somebody else can't testify. So it does happen, but I can tell you from my experience as a DA, we were kind of an independent body. I mean, most district attorneys did what they felt was right, and the police officers are the ones that investigate the case. But since you're an officer of the court as a lawyer, you do your own independent assessment on credibility and what evidence you want to put in. And so sometimes there were conflicts with law enforcement, and there were even incidents where district attorneys would report police officers. And I think now the DA's office in Los Angeles is much more open on disclosing prior misconduct of officers to defense lawyers, so those defense lawyers have the tools to defend their clients, whereas before it was a much more closed process. And oftentimes the DAs didn't know who they were dealing with. You might have an officer with a bunch of problems in the past that you had no idea. And I think it's a lot more transparent now. Doctor, go ahead, Ninette.
If I may add real quick, I feel that my steepest learning curve in understanding prosecution and understanding the DA's office's policies and the way in which they did things was sitting through trial as an investigating officer. And it wasn't until I became a detective and sat through trial where I saw all the things that could go wrong in a case, all the concerns that the DA has that a patrol officer may not fully appreciate or understand. Because you have to realize that as a patrol officer, whatever arrest you make, you don't get to see how that whole trial unfolds and all the things that go wrong for the DA. Only the investigating officer gets to see that. And I think having officers sit through other trials that they're not part of and look at how many things go wrong and how quickly it can go wrong would add some appreciation from their perspective, understand why it is that the DAs demand certain things and why they are made to feel like they're put through the ringer when they take the stand.
Got it. Dr. Pavlo, we're almost done with our webinar here. Any final comments or thoughts about reform and the first steps law enforcement or departments should take to improve the process and make the public have more confidence in what's happening?
Excellent question, and I wish we had more time to really go into that, but I think communication is key. Transparency is going to be a huge factor, and educating the community. Each community is different, and they don't know the rules of engagement. And what I mean by that is, what do you do if you get lit up by a police officer? Do you some people literally don't know. They put their foot on the accelerator. They're afraid they might be deported. They're afraid that, as Ninette brought up early on in this webinar, that they just committed a crime, and this officer knows when the officer's stopping you because your registration is past due. So I think we really have to educate, and we have to have police officers be more aware of a broader perspective of what emotional intelligence is, how to read people, how to talk to people, de-escalate. And I think we're doing that right now. But again, I can't speak for most departments throughout the country. It doesn't look like they're on the same page.
All right. Concluding remarks, 30 seconds or less, guys, so we can finish. DeWitt, your final thoughts on how to make the public feel more safe and comfortable calling law enforcement.
I think it goes with who you put on the job. And to be very frank and brief, look, this is not made for everybody. Everybody can't be a police officer. Everybody doesn't have the talent and or the heart for it. And there has to be some weeding out. And that starts with the department itself. The department has to take a real honest look at itself. And that's not just the LAPD, but departments around California and even the nation, and say, who is really going to put forward the values that we teach in the police academy about community, about honesty, about integrity, and who is here for the action, the action hounds who just want to pull out their guns or to have the TV moment. And they got to do some serious weeding out. And then we could get to some honest community policing that I think is going to be the better for all of us.
Ninette?
I think I'd like to add to what DeWitt said earlier during this webinar, and that is we need to have the ability to have honest, frank discussions about policing, about what officers go through, as well as the history of our nation, race, socioeconomics, communities, and so forth, without it feeling like it's an attack or that we're blaming anybody, but rather just speaking honestly from the different perspectives to try to find common ground and understanding what it's like to walk in somebody else's shoes.
And I want to echo that. I think having programs like this where we can discuss with LAPD psychologist and a former detective, a civil rights lawyer, and a defense lawyer / former district attorney, how the process actually deals with police misconduct, what steps are being taken to reform the process, what psychological stressors law enforcement faces. All these are important topics that when you just see a police officer shoot somebody on TV, that's horrendous. It's a tragedy, but it doesn't actually show what happens every day on the streets with law enforcement, in courts with law enforcement and the accused. So I think having these type of seminars and discussions about these important issues will make the public better aware of what's going on and perhaps provide the public more understanding of policing, of how to be respectful with the police, and also having the police officers be more respectful of the public. So none of us, when we have to call 911, we don't have to think twice about doing that. We can feel safe doing that. I want to thank all the speakers. Ninette Toosbuy, former LAPD detective, Dr. Pavlo, psychologist and an expert in psychology with law enforcement and works for LAPD. Thank you. And with Lacy, our civil rights preeminent expert here. Thank you guys for joining us on this webinar. I appreciate it very much. To all the people that joined us, thank you for being part of this important program, and hopefully we'll have more presentations like this, more dialogues like this, so the public is aware and understands what we're dealing with here in the real world in courts and on the streets. So I'm going to sign off. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye, guys.